In the winter of 1086, when frost hardened the fields of England and smoke from low thatched roofs hung beneath a pale sky, the people of the village of Askford saw 6 horsemen emerge from the morning mist. At first, the villagers thought they were soldiers, and in one sense they were, for every man who rode beneath the king's seal carried the force of an army behind him. Yet these men had not come with ladders, axes, or burning torches. They carried leather cases, wax tablets, rolls of parchment, and questions. Their leader was a stern Norman named Robert de Vaux, a royal commissioner whose dark cloak was fastened with a bronze clasp bearing the lion of the king. Beside him rode Brother Matthew, an English-born clerk who could speak the language of the conquerors and the language of the conquered. Behind them came 2 mounted sergeants, a young scribe named Alain, and an aging surveyor whose saddlebags held knotted cords for measuring land. The village reeve rang the small church bell, and men and women gathered in silence before the timber hall. Children hid behind their mothers. Oxen breathed clouds into the cold air. No one knew exactly what the visitors wanted, but everyone had heard rumors. The king was counting every field. The king was counting every animal. The king wanted to know who owned the mill, who used the woodland, who paid rent, who owed labor, and who had hidden wealth. Some said the king planned to take half of everything. Others said he intended to punish those who had profited from rebellion. A few whispered that the strangers were preparing a record so final that no man, not even a lord, could escape what was written in it. Robert dismounted and entered the hall without greeting anyone. He ordered the local priest, the reeve, 6 villagers, and representatives from neighboring settlements to stand before him. Alain opened his inkhorn. Brother Matthew translated the commissioner's first question. "What is the name of this manor?" The reeve answered. "Who held it in the time of King Edward?" The reeve looked toward the Norman lord seated near the fire. "Who holds it now?" The lord's jaw tightened. "How many hides of land are there? How many plows in the lord's domain? How many belong to the villagers? How many free men, smallholders, servants, and enslaved people live here? How much meadow? How much woodland? Is there a mill, a fishery? How many pigs can the wood support? What was the manor worth before King William came? What was it worth when the present lord received it? What is it worth today?" Each question seemed to strip another layer of secrecy from the village. The people had survived war, confiscation, hunger, and the arrival of foreign masters. Now they faced something they understood less than violence, a government determined to remember. As Alain's quill began to scratch across the parchment, an old farmer named Edric watched the marks appear and felt a fear deeper than the fear of swords. A soldier might seize grain and ride away. A fire might destroy a house and eventually fade into memory. But a written judgment could outlive every witness. Nearly 20 years earlier, a duke from across the sea had conquered England with ships, horses, archers, and steel. Now King William intended to conquer it again, not by taking its castles, but by learning the value of every acre. For the first time, an entire kingdom was being transformed into names, measurements, obligations, and numbers, and no one in Askford yet understood that the book, being born from those questions, would remember them for almost 1,000 years. To understand why the king needed such a record, one had to return to the year 1066, before Norman castles scarred the English landscape and before French voices commanded English courts. England was then ruled by Edward the Confessor, an aging king, without a direct heir. His court was filled with rival families, promises, ambitions, and claims that could not all be honored. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, believed Edward had promised him the English crown. William also claimed that Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English nobleman, had sworn to support him. Whatever had truly been promised, the matter changed when Edward died in January 1066, and the English council chose Harold as king. Harold was crowned quickly, and William received the news as both an insult and a declaration of war. In Normandy, trees were felled, sails were sewn, weapons were forged, and a fleet was assembled on a scale few had imagined possible. William persuaded knights, adventurers, younger sons, and ambitious lords that England offered land, glory, and divine approval. The Duke's banner was blessed, horses were loaded into ships. Men who had never seen England crossed a dangerous sea to win estates they knew only as names. Harold, meanwhile, faced another invasion in the north. His estranged brother Tostig and the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada landed with a formidable army. Harold marched north at astonishing speed and defeated them at Stamford Bridge. But before his exhausted men could recover, news arrived that William had landed in the south. Harold turned his army around and marched again. On the 14th of October, 1066, the English and Norman forces met near Hastings. The English formed a shield wall on high ground. The Normans attacked with archers, infantry, and cavalry. For hours, the hill became a place of splintered shields, screaming horses, broken spears, and men, crushed beneath the weight of those falling around them. At moments, William's army appeared close to collapse. A rumor spread that the Duke had been killed, and he was said to have lifted his helmet so his soldiers could see that he still lived. Norman cavalry charged and withdrew. Some English warriors broke formation to pursue them, opening gaps in the shield wall. By evening, Harold was dead. Many of England's leading nobles lay beside him, and William had won the battle that would define his life. Yet one battle did not give him a peaceful kingdom. London did not immediately surrender. English lords considered other candidates. Regions far from the south still possessed armies, loyalties, and traditions of resistance. William moved carefully, burning where he needed to frighten, negotiating where he needed acceptance, and taking control of roads and towns. On Christmas Day, he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. During the ceremony, when the English and Norman nobles shouted their approval, guards outside mistook the noise for an attack and set nearby houses on fire. Smoke entered the church as William received the crown. It was an omen of the rule to come. Authority proclaimed beneath sacred arches, while fear burned beyond the walls. William had taken England, but possession was not the same as control. He ruled a people whose language he did not speak, whose customs were older than his dynasty, and whose nobles had not forgotten that he was a foreign conqueror. Rebellions erupted. Danish fleets threatened the coast. English leaders sought support from Scotland and beyond. In the north, resistance became so dangerous that William answered with a campaign of devastation later remembered as the Harrying of the North. Villages were burned, stores of food destroyed, and fields left uncultivated. The conquest that had begun at Hastings spread into the lives of ordinary people who had never seen the battlefield. The new king built castles at strategic points, great mounds and timber towers that allowed small Norman garrisons to dominate towns and roads. These fortresses were more than military defenses. They were statements written in earth and wood. The king was present. The king could see, the king could punish. Still, castles could control only the ground around them. To govern the whole country, William needed loyal men, and loyal men expected rewards. The reward was land. After the conquest, England's fields, forests, villages, mills, fisheries, and manors were redistributed on a vast scale. William declared himself the ultimate source of lawful possession. Estates that had belonged to English earls, thanes, and families for generations passed into Norman hands. Some English landholders retained small properties for a time, especially if they submitted early or proved useful, but the direction of change was unmistakable. A new aristocracy rose over the old landscape. William's half-brothers received enormous territories. Great warriors were granted clusters of estates. Bishops loyal to the new regime replaced English churchmen. Lesser knights received manors from greater barons and, in return, promised service in war. At the base of this hierarchy lived the people who actually worked the land: villagers with customary holdings, smallholders with little property, free men in some regions, servants attached to lordly households and enslaved, people whose lives could be counted as part of an estate's resources. The names of the lords changed more quickly than the rhythm of the seasons. Wheat still had to be sown, sheep still had to be watched, mills still turned when rivers ran high. Yet the obligations attached to those labors could be transformed overnight by a royal grant. In Askeford, the manor had once belonged to an English thegn named Wulfgar. He had ridden south with Harold and never returned from Hastings. His widow, Leofrin, tried to hold the estate for their young son, but 2 years later a Norman knight named Hugh de Montmorency arrived with a sealed writ declaring that the king had granted him the manor. Hugh knew little English, and Leofrin knew no French. Their first meeting took place through gestures, an interpreter, and the presence of armed men. The widow was allowed to remain in a smaller house, but the hall, the best fields, and the mill passed to Hugh. Her son grew up not as heir to the manor, but as a dependent within the land his father had ruled. Such stories occurred in different forms across the kingdom. Norman lords often held estates scattered through several counties, a deliberate arrangement that made it harder for any one noble to build a single, independent territory. But the system created confusion. Boundaries remembered by villagers did not always match boundaries claimed by new lords. A meadow might be used by one settlement, taxed with another, and granted by royal writ to a third party. Churches possessed ancient charters whose authenticity could be disputed. Lords seized woodland while neighboring villages insisted they had customary rights to graze animals there. A knight might claim that a manor had been empty when he received it, while surviving members of the previous owner's family insisted they had been driven out. Even royal officials did not always know the truth. Old tax assessments survived from before the conquest, but they did not necessarily reflect current wealth. Some estates had been damaged by war. Others had become more valuable under energetic new owners. Mills had been built, vineyards attempted, woodland cleared, fisheries expanded, and villages abandoned. The king's treasury depended partly on geld, an established English land tax that existed before William's invasion. England had long possessed sophisticated administrative traditions, including shires, hundreds, local courts, royal writs, and systems for assessing land. William did not invent taxation, nor did he create government from nothing. His genius, if it could be called that, lay in taking the machinery he inherited and binding it to Norman military power. Yet by the 1080s, the machinery was under strain. A tax assessment might say that an estate owed a certain amount, while the lord claimed the land was too poor to pay. Another manor might produce rich harvests, while contributing far less than its true resources suggested. Some royal rights disappeared into the hands of sheriffs. Some sheriffs extracted more than the king required and kept the difference. Noblemen presented conflicting claims, each supported by witnesses who depended on them. The conquest had made William one of the greatest landowners in Europe, but it had also buried the truth beneath layers of violence, memory, and self-interest. The more land he gave away, the more he needed to know what exactly he had given, what remained his, and what those who held from him owed in return. By 1085, William was no longer the vigorous invader who had stood on the beach beneath a papal banner. He was in his late 50s, heavy in body, relentless in will, and increasingly aware that victories did not last unless they were turned into institutions. His kingdom faced pressure from several directions. Across the North Sea, King Canute, the Holy of Denmark, prepared an invasion fleet. William remembered too well that Danish armies had once conquered England, and that many English people, especially in the north and east, retained memories of Scandinavian rule. A major invasion would require troops, food, horses, ships, money, and reliable knowledge of what each lord could provide. At the same time, William's own barons had grown powerful. Some controlled hundreds of estates. They owed their fortunes to the king, but gratitude was not a permanent political system. A wealthy lord with castles, knights, and local influence could become a danger if royal authority weakened. William needed to see the structure of his kingdom as a whole, not through flattering reports from men who benefited from his ignorance. At Gloucester, during the Christmas court of 1085, the king gathered bishops, abbots, earls, barons, and advisors. Outside, winter rain darkened the timber walls. Inside, fires burned and the hall smelled of wet wool, smoke, spiced wine, and horse leather. Messengers spoke of Danish ships. Treasury officers complained of uncertain assessments. Churchmen brought disputes over property. Noblemen accused rivals of unlawful seizure. William listened, his face giving little away. According to later accounts, after deep discussion, he ordered an extraordinary survey of the realm. The decision was simple to announce and almost impossible to execute. Royal commissioners would travel through England. They would investigate landholding county by county and hundred by hundred. They would ask who had held each estate in the time of King Edward, who held it now, how much land it contained, how many plow teams worked it, how many people lived there by legal and economic category, what meadows, woods, pastures, mills, and fisheries belonged to it, what it had once been worth, what it had been worth when granted, and what it was worth in the present. They would also record whether more value could be taken from it. The inquiry would not rely solely on the word of each lord. Local juries would testify under oath. English and French inhabitants would be questioned. Neighboring communities could challenge false claims. Earlier records would be compared with present conditions. The kingdom itself would be called as a witness. Some in the hall must have understood the danger at once. The king was not merely seeking revenue. He was examining the wealth and legitimacy of the men who served him. A lord who had quietly enlarged his estate might be exposed. A sheriff who had concealed royal income could be questioned. A monastery that claimed ancient privilege might be forced to prove it. William's order reached into every level of landholding, from the king's own estates to the smallest recorded settlement. It demanded a memory of England before the conquest and an accounting of England after it. The work later became associated with the name Domesday, like the Day of Judgment, when nothing could be hidden and no final decision appealed. But at Gloucester, there was not yet a famous book. There was only a command and the machinery of royal power beginning to move. Commissioners were selected in groups, often sent to regions where they themselves did not hold land, reducing the temptation to protect their own interests. Lists were prepared. Routes were planned. Sheriffs were ordered to summon local officials and jurors. Clerks sharpened quills and gathered parchment. Men who had conquered with lances now prepared to conquer with questions. When Robert de Vaux received his commission, he was told that the king wanted accuracy more than comfort. Robert had served in war and knew how to compel obedience, but he soon discovered that land could be more difficult to capture on parchment than a fortress was to capture by siege. A castle had walls one could see. A manor was made of boundaries remembered differently by every witness, rights shared by custom, obligations measured in labor, and values that shifted with harvest, weather, and fear. Brother Matthew, assigned as interpreter, understood the deeper problem. The survey was written in the language of rulers, but its truth lived in the speech of villagers. Between the two stood men like him, carrying answers across a political divide. In early 1086, Robert's party rode out. Similar groups traveled elsewhere. They crossed frozen roads and flooded rivers. passed beneath new Norman towers, and entered settlements where the arrival of royal officers could silence an entire marketplace. England was about to be interrogated. The work did not proceed as a single army marching from one end of the country to the other. It unfolded through circuits, local courts, county gatherings, preliminary returns, revisions, and comparisons. Yet to those who saw commissioners arrive, it felt as direct as invasion. Robert's party began in a market town where the sheriff had assembled landholders and representatives from surrounding hundreds. The great men sat near the front, dressed in fur-lined cloaks, while priests, reeves, and village jurors waited behind them. Robert placed the king's writ on the table. Brother Matthew read its authority aloud in English. No one could pretend not to understand. Witnesses were sworn. The questions began. At first the answers came smoothly. A bishop's estate contained a known number of hides. A royal manor supported several plows. A mill paid a fixed annual sum. Then disputes surfaced. Two lords claimed the same woodland. A monastery insisted that its land was free from certain dues. An English freeholder declared that a Norman knight had taken his meadow without warrant. The knight laughed until Robert ordered the complaint recorded. The laughter stopped. At another hearing, a widow named Edith stepped forward carrying a small wooden box. Inside was a worn charter bearing a seal from before the Conquest. She claimed that her husband had held 3 hides freely, and that after his death a local lord's steward had absorbed them into a larger manor. The steward argued that the land had been forfeited during rebellion. Edith answered that her husband had died of fever before the rebellion began. The dates were uncertain. Witnesses disagreed. Robert asked neighboring villagers to speak. Some lowered their eyes, unwilling to offend the steward. An old priest finally supported Edith's account. The commissioners recorded both claim and response, knowing that writing did not always settle truth, but made denial more difficult. The journey continued. Roads dissolved into mud. Horses lost shoes. One clerk developed a fever. At river crossings, wax tablets and parchment had to be wrapped in oiled cloth. In some villages, people welcomed the inquiry because they hoped the king would correct abuses by local lords. In others, they saw only another demand from distant rulers. Landowners attempted to influence the process with hospitality. Tables were laid with meat, ale, and imported wine. Robert accepted food when necessary, but refused gifts. Not every commissioner was equally strict. Rumors spread that silver could soften an assessment or persuade a clerk to misunderstand a boundary. The survey's authority was enormous, but its agents were human. Brother Matthew spent evenings listening to villagers after Robert had retired. They spoke of fields burned in earlier campaigns, sons taken into service, rents raised by new lords, and churches rebuilt in foreign style. They also spoke of ordinary matters that never reached royal parchment: a woman who knew which herbs eased childbirth, a shepherd who could find lost animals in snow, a boy who sang beautifully, a spring believed to cure fever. Matthew began to understand how much of a kingdom could never be counted. The commissioners recorded plows, but not the pain in a man's shoulders after using one. They recorded mills, but not the sound that kept nearby children awake. They recorded households, but rarely the names of those within them. They recorded value in pounds and shillings, yet value meant different things to king, lord, and villager. To the treasury, a woodland was income. To a peasant family, it was winter, fuel, grazing, berries, honey, and survival. To a nobleman, it was hunting ground and status. To the king, it was another piece of a realm that must be made legible. As the party approached Askford, Hugh de Montmorency learned of their coming 3 days in advance. His steward, Lambert, immediately began preparing. 24 pigs were driven from the manor's woodland to an estate held by Hugh's cousin. Sacks of grain were moved from the main storehouse to a barn beyond the old boundary. The miller was instructed to report that the mill had been damaged by flooding and produced only half its usual income. Villagers were warned that anyone who contradicted the lord's account would lose grazing rights. Hugh believed the king's officials wanted numbers, and numbers could be arranged. He did not expect the inquiry to reopen the story of the land itself. Old Leofrin, widow of Wulfgar, heard the warnings and said nothing. Her son had died years earlier, leaving her without the heir for whom she had once endured humiliation. She owned little now beyond a few animals, a garden, and memory. But memory was precisely what the commissioners had come to collect. On the morning Robert entered Askford's hall, Hugh sat near the fire wearing a sword with a jeweled hilt. He was no longer the young knight who had arrived after Hastings. His hair had thinned, his estate had expanded, and he considered himself secure. Lambert stood behind him with a bundle of accounts. The first questions concerned ownership. Who held this manor in the time of King Edward? Brother Matthew asked. The reeve answered, Wulfgar, son of Osric. Who holds it now? Lord Hugh de Montmorency, by grant of King William. Hugh nodded. How much land was assessed? The reeve hesitated. Lambert answered for him, stating a figure smaller than the old villagers expected. Robert looked at the reeve. You were summoned to testify, not the steward. The reeve swallowed and repeated Lambert's number. Alain wrote it down. How many ploughs can the land support? Again came an answer. How many ploughs are in the Lord's domain? How many among the villagers? How many villagers? Smallholders, servants, and slaves? Each category was debated. A family might be called free by one witness and dependent by another. A holding might be counted separately or absorbed into a neighbor's. Robert demanded names from the jurors, then asked the same questions in altered order to test consistency. When he asked about the mill, Lambert presented an account showing low income after flood damage. Robert sent the surveyor and 2 villagers to inspect it. They returned before midday. The wheel was sound, the stones recently dressed, and flour dust covered the floor. A remarkable ruin, Robert said. Hugh's face hardened. Lambert blamed the miller. The miller blamed the steward. Robert ordered the full value investigated. Next came the woodland. Hugh claimed it could support 100 pigs. Several villagers glanced toward Edric, the old farmer. He had lived in Eskford under Wulfgar and Hugh. His back was bent, but his memory remained sharp. Brother Matthew asked whether the figure was correct. Edric knew that the wood had supported nearly 200 pigs in a good mast year. He also knew that Hugh's men had moved animals before the commissioners arrived. Lambert's warning echoed in his mind. Without grazing rights, Edric's daughter and grandchildren might lose their cow. 100, he said softly. Robert watched him. You swear this? Edric looked toward the small wooden cross held by the priest. He felt the gaze of the entire village. He thought of hunger, punishment, and the certainty that royal officials would eventually ride away while Hugh remained. I swear that is what I was told to say, he answered. The hall became silent. Hugh rose so quickly that his bench fell backward. This man is confused. Robert's sergeants placed their hands on their swords. Sit, the commissioner ordered. Hugh remained standing for one dangerous moment, then obeyed. Robert questioned Edric carefully. The old farmer described the pigs moved at night, the hidden grain, and the steward's threats. Others began to speak. The miller admitted. The accounts were false. A smallholder named Godric revealed that a meadow beyond the stream had been absorbed into Hugh's domain without reducing village obligations. The reeve confessed that Lambert had dictated the figures. Robert did not assume every accusation was true. Fear could produce lies in both directions. He separated witnesses and questioned them again. He sent men to the neighboring estate, where fresh pig tracks and unfamiliar animals were found. He compared the boundary described by Askford's jurors with testimony from the next village. By evening, the neat account Lambert had prepared had collapsed. Yet the most difficult question had not been asked. Was all this land held by Wulfgar when King Edward was alive? Robert said. Leofrin stepped forward from the rear of the hall. Though bent with age, she carried herself with the remnants of authority. Not all, she said in English, Brother Matthew translated. She explained that the western meadow and 2 tenant holdings had belonged to a free man named Senrid, whose family fled during the disturbances after the Conquest. Hugh had later joined them to the manor. Hugh replied that abandoned land reverted to the king and had been included in his grant. Show the writ, Robert said. Hugh produced the document that granted him Asford, but its boundaries were not precise. Leofrin then described stones, trees, and an old ditch that marked the former division. The surveyor examined them the next day. Some markers remained. Neighboring jurors remembered Senred. The commissioners recorded the dispute rather than pretending certainty. For Hugh, even that was dangerous. A question, placed in the king's record, could draw royal attention. For Leofrin, it was a strange victory. The land would not return to her, and Sinred's descendants might never know of the inquiry, but the official account would no longer present Hugh's possession as unquestioned truth. During the final session, Robert asked the values before the Conquest, when Hugh received the manor, and now. The answers revealed a history in numbers. The estate had been prosperous under Wulfgar. Its value had fallen during years of disorder. Under Hugh, the mill and domain had increased their income, but the burden on some villagers had grown. Royal revenue had not risen as much as private profit. Alain wrote the figures in abbreviated Latin. Edric watched, unable to read a single word. Will the king punish us? He asked Brother Matthew after the hall emptied. Matthew could not promise mercy. The survey might lead to higher demands. It might also restrain Hugh. It might do both. The king will know, Matthew said. Edric stared at the parchment. A king knows only what men tell him. Matthew looked toward the marks made from their testimony. Then today, he replied, men told him more than Lord Hugh intended. The inquiry at Aceford was one small episode in a national process, but it captured the tension at the heart of the Great Survey. The king demanded a picture of England as it was, Yet every answer was shaped by England as it had been. The commissioners asked who held land in the time of King Edward because the Conquest had created a before and an after. In one column of memory stood English thanes, earls, freeholders, and churchmen. In the present stood Norman barons, knights, bishops, abbots, and royal servants. The comparison exposed one of the most dramatic transfers of property in European history. A family that had dominated a county before 1066 might appear 20 years later only as a former owner's name. A Norman lord who had arrived with little more than a horse and sword could now control dozens of manors. Yet the record did not tell a simple story of universal decline or improvement. Some estates were worth more than before. Lords reorganized domain farming, built mills, expanded markets, and increased rents. Other places remained poor because of war, depopulation, damaged fields, or local conditions. In Yorkshire and parts of the north, entries describing waste revealed the long shadow of devastation. The word could mean different states of abandonment or reduced value, but behind it lay communities that had suffered. A line stating that a manor was worth nothing could represent burned homes, empty fields, dead livestock, and families dispersed beyond the reach of scribes. In the east, where free peasants were more numerous, records became especially complex. Rights and holdings overlapped. Men could owe service to one lord while occupying land connected to another estate. Some possessed small parcels scattered across several places. The commissioner's question sought order, but the countryside had never been organized solely for the convenience of royal accountants. Even the unit of the hide, often associated with tax assessment, did not always represent a fixed physical area. It could express an obligation rather than a simple measurement. The survey, therefore, combined geography, law, memory, status, and fiscal responsibility. It was not a modern census, though it counted many people by category. It was not a complete map, though it described land and resources. It was not merely a tax list, though taxation stood near its center. It was an instrument for understanding who held what from whom and what that possession was worth to the crown. As the circuits completed their hearings, preliminary records were brought to larger gatherings where claims could be challenged. Landholders discovered that statements made in 100 might be compared with testimony from another. A lord who concealed a mill in one place could be exposed by the obligations recorded for neighboring estates. A church's claim to exemption might be tested against older custom. The process created opportunities for justice and for manipulation. Powerful men had more documents, more witnesses, and more influence. Poor villagers spoke under the eyes of those who controlled their livelihoods. Translation could alter meaning. Clerks could misunderstand names. Still, the survey made local knowledge travel upward. The king's government drew information from people who would never see the royal court. Their words passed through juries, commissioners' notes, summaries, and scribal abbreviations until they became part of a central record. Brother Matthew often thought of what was lost in that journey. An English name might be distorted in Latin. A complicated dispute might shrink to a sentence. A field remembered for a battle, a wedding, or a flood became simply meadow. A man's lifetime of work became one entry under the estate of a lord who had never touched a plow. Yet what survived was astonishing. Thousands of settlements, many still existing centuries later, entered written history. Rivers, woods, mills, saltworks, fisheries, vineyards, beehives, pasture, and plow teams formed an economic portrait of medieval England. The document would eventually become invaluable, not because it perfectly represented every life, but because no other surviving record approached its scale. For William, however, the purpose was immediate. He wanted to know the resources of his realm, the obligations of his tenants-in-chief, the condition of royal estates, and the truth behind property claims. He was preparing for danger. The Danish invasion never came in the form feared, but the survey still served the deeper needs of monarchy. An army might be assembled for one campaign. Information could support rule for generations. When the commissioners' returns reached the royal administration, another stage began. Information gathered in halls, churches, and county courts had to be transformed into a usable record. Parchment was expensive, made from carefully prepared animal skins. Ink had to be mixed. Quills had to be cut and recut. Clerks, trained in Latin, condensed a vast amount of testimony into formulaic entries. The resulting work was organized largely by county and then by landholder, allowing the king to see the estates held by each of his tenants-in-chief. The king's own lands came first. Church estates followed in established order. Great lords appeared with the manors they held directly from the crown, while lesser tenants were named beneath them. This structure revealed the kingdom as a chain of possession descending from William. It was a political vision as much as an administrative one. Every estate was connected, through layers of tenure, to the king. Alain, the young scribe who had traveled with Robert, was reassigned for a time to a writing chamber where drafts and returns were compared. He had imagined that the hardest work occurred on muddy roads, but the chamber brought its own exhaustion. Day after day, he bent over parchment under weak winter light. His fingers cramped. Candle smoke irritated his eyes. Abbreviations saved space, but demanded precision. A single error in a place name could confuse an estate. A misplaced number could alter value. Around him, other clerks murmured Latin phrases, sharpened quills, and argued over inconsistent reports. Bundles arrived from different circuits, some clear, others chaotic. Marginal notes indicated disputes. Repeated formulas gave the work a rhythm. This man holds there is land for so many plows, it was worth, now it is worth. Behind each phrase, Alain remembered faces. When he copied the entry for Eskford, he saw Edric standing beneath Hugh's anger. He saw Leofrind describing boundary stones from a vanished world. Yet the final entry could not contain their fear or courage. It recorded the manor, the holders, the resources, the population categories, and the values. Hugh's attempted concealment survived only indirectly in the book. Corrected figures, and perhaps in a note about disputed land. History was being compressed. Most counties were eventually entered into what became known as Great Domesday, a highly abbreviated volume. Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex were preserved in a more detailed form called Little Domesday, despite containing more detail and, in physical terms, not being insignificant. Scholars have long debated exactly how the compilation process unfolded and why the surviving forms differ. To Alain, no explanation seemed necessary beyond the overwhelming scale of the task. The king had asked for an entire country. No set of books could contain all of it. Decisions had to be made about what mattered. Those decisions favored land, lordship, obligation, production, and value. The surveyors had asked about people, but usually not as unique individuals. Villagers, smallholders, slaves, and freemen appeared as numbers. Women surfaced occasionally as landholders or former holders, but the daily labor of most women remained hidden. Children were largely absent. Craftsmen might appear when economically relevant. Towns were treated differently from rural manors. London and Winchester, among the most important cities, were not preserved in the surviving Domesday account in the same way as much of the countryside. Parts of England were not surveyed, or did not survive in the final compilation, including much of the far north, under different political conditions. The book was vast, but not complete. No government record ever is. Still, the intellectual ambition was extraordinary. Without printing presses, standardized forms, modern maps, or electronic calculation, William's administration gathered and organized information about a kingdom of perhaps more than 1 million people. The record was not designed for ordinary reading. It was a working instrument of power, written by specialists for rulers and officials. But as the pages accumulated, the clerks sensed they were creating something unlike any ordinary account. "Do you think the king will read all of it?" Alain asked an older scribe one night. The man laughed quietly. "Kings do not need to read every word. They need others to know the words exist." That answer remained with Alain. The strength of the survey did not depend on William personally memorizing each manor. Its strength lay in the possibility that the crown could open the record and compare claim with entry. The book made distant knowledge present at the center. A baron standing before the king could no longer assume that no one knew the value of his estates. A sheriff could be questioned with figures gathered outside his own accounts. A monastery could point to recorded rights. The parchment did not wield a sword, but it changed the balance between those who ruled locally and the ruler who claimed authority over all. The psychological force of the record grew because medieval society placed immense weight on judgment, oath, memory, and divine order. Most people could not read the Latin entries, yet they understood that writing carried authority. Spoken testimony could be challenged. A witness could change his story or die. A boundary marker could be moved. A charter could be lost in fire. But a royal record preserved in the king's treasury seemed to stand beyond ordinary uncertainty. In later generations, the survey came to be called Domesday Book, a name connected to the Last Judgment described in Christian teaching when every deed would be revealed and no appeal would overturn the final sentence. The comparison was not exact, and the name was not necessarily the one used by those who conducted the inquiry in 1086. Yet it captured how the record was perceived, comprehensive, severe, and final. One story told of landholders disputing a manor before royal officials. Each produced witnesses. Each claimed ancient right. At last the record was consulted, and the entry determined whose possession the government recognized. Whether every dispute was truly settled, so simply mattered less than the principle. The book represented the crown's memory. To challenge it was to challenge the organized authority of the kingdom. Years after the commissioners left, Eskford, Hugh de Montmorency, traveled to a royal court over a dispute involving the Western Meadow. A neighboring lord claimed part of it under a different grant. Hugh expected his sword service and connections to carry more weight than village testimony. But an official referred to the survey return. The disputed status had been recorded. The matter could not be dismissed as a recent invention. Hugh won control of most of the land, yet the crown imposed conditions and reclaimed a small portion, attached to royal dues. He returned furious, not because he had lost everything, but because the words of peasants had followed him into a hall where those peasants would never be allowed to stand. Leofrind did not live to hear the outcome. She died during a hard winter, buried near the church beside her husband's family. Edric survived longer. Hugh never forgave him, but open punishment would have appeared as revenge against a royal witness. Instead, Lambert enforced every customary obligation strictly. Edric's household received no favors. Yet the old farmer's grazing rights were not removed, perhaps because Hugh knew that the record now contained enough detail to invite questions if the village suddenly changed. The survey did not bring freedom. It did not end exploitation. It did not transform peasants into equal subjects before the law. But knowledge could restrain arbitrary power in limited and unpredictable ways. The same record that allowed the king to demand more could also expose a lord who took more than the recognized custom. This double nature made Domesday both feared and useful. For the crown, it supported taxation and control. For landholders, it could confirm title. For churches, it could preserve claims. For later officials, it became evidence. For ordinary people, its immediate effects varied. Some may have faced heavier burdens when hidden resources were discovered. Others may have gained protection when unlawful seizures were noted. Many probably experienced little visible change beyond the disruption of the inquiry. No one in 1086 could know that historians centuries later would use the entries to reconstruct population, agriculture, settlement patterns, social structure, and the consequences of conquest. William's officials were not writing for the future. They were solving the problems of their present. Yet the future became their unintended audience. Every abbreviation that frustrated a modern reader had once saved a scribe time. Every place name was written for administrators who knew the geography. Every category reflected distinctions important to Norman and English governance. The book preserved not a neutral photograph, but the kingdom as royal power chose to see it. That limitation was also a revelation. By studying what the record counted, one could see what the state valued. Land that produced revenue mattered. Men who owed service mattered. Mills, fisheries, and woodland mattered. Legal possession mattered. The countless emotions attached to those things did not. Domesday was therefore both a window and a wall. A window into the economic and political order of 11th century England, and a wall blocking most of the inner lives behind the numbers. Imagine then the final pages resting in the king's treasury. The parchment is thick beneath the fingers. The script is dense and controlled. County follows county, lord follows lord, manor follows manor. The king's own estates stand beside the possessions of bishops and barons. A few words can contain a village. A few numbers can summarize the labor of generations. Somewhere, Askford is fixed in ink. It has land for a certain number of plows. It has meadow and woodland. It has a mill. It had one value before the conquest, another when Hugh received it, another at the time of the survey. Wulfgar's name belongs to the past. Hugh's belongs to the present. Edric is not named. Leofrind may not be named. Yet their voices shaped what the page says. William may never have looked at that particular entry. He did not need to. The possibility that he could look was enough. Across England, landholders knew the crown had asked. They knew neighbors had testified. They knew values had been compared. They knew the government possessed a memory independent of their own accounts. That knowledge altered the nature of rule. The sword remained essential. Rebellion could still be crushed, castles still garrisoned, taxes still enforced by threat. But force now worked beside documentation. The Conqueror's kingdom had become a recorded kingdom. When William landed in 1066, he faced a country from the outside. By 1086, through the survey, he attempted to see it from within, its estates, resources, hierarchies, and obligations. He could trace how much of the old order had been replaced and how much wealth now flowed through men bound to him. He could identify what the crown possessed directly and what it had granted away. He could prepare for invasion, challenge concealment, and reinforce the principle that every great estate existed beneath royal authority. The project was not the invention of taxation. Long before William, kings, temples, cities, and empires had demanded grain, labor, livestock, silver, and military service. Anglo-Saxon England itself had sophisticated taxes and records. William's distinctive act was to commission one of the most comprehensive surviving surveys of a medieval kingdom, combining older English institutions with Norman determination. The result became far more enduring than the immediate crisis that inspired it. The Danish threat passed. The exact fiscal use of the survey changed. William died. His sons fought. Yet the book remained, consulted and recopied, moved and protected through wars and political upheavals. Centuries later, when paper replaced parchment in ordinary administration, when printing multiplied texts, when parliaments limited kings, when industrial cities transformed the countryside, Domesday still survived. It survived the Reformation, Civil War, Revolution, and World War. It entered archives governed by institutions William could never have imagined. Scholars photographed and digitized it. People searched its entries from homes lit by electricity, asking whether their towns appeared in the record. The book, created to make a kingdom knowable to one ruler, became a way for millions to know something about the distant past. That is the final reversal in its story. William sought control over the present. He gave the future memory. The people counted as resources became ancestors. The settlements valued for tax became communities proud of their ancient names. The conquered landscape became a historical map, read by descendants of conqueror and conquered alike. Even the silence of the record became meaningful, reminding us to look for those omitted from official vision.